Good morning. Welcome to Tuesdays with Kamira, your Teen for Parents magazine's Tuesday conversation, live conversation. We have a very important topic today, and we're going to get to it as soon as I cover a couple of housekeeping things. The first being that if you're joining us live today, thank you for doing that, and know that you are free and welcome to post questions or comments for our guest in the comment section. I'll be looking for those, and she will address them live on air. If you are watching a replay, thank you for doing that. A lot of people do that. You can post any comments and dialogue with other people who are watching replay, but know that Dr. McIntosh will not be here to dialogue with you. After the show, she will leave us. Thank you for joining us, Belinda. We are grateful to have you here, and we know that we're going to learn a lot from you. I want to say a couple of statistics first and a couple of things I'm going to read if people will just indulge me. Today, or this month really, is Suicide Prevention Month. It's something that Belinda knows a lot about, and she's going to tell us when she tells us her background. But did you know that roughly 46,000 Americans die by suicide each year? And that translates to about one death every 11 minutes. According to the CDC, suicide is the second leading cause of death for individuals ages 10 to 24. And suicide is the second leading cause of death for college-age youth ages 12 to 18. So it's something very topical and something that we as adults who are raising teens and tweens need to know more about. Even if your teen or tween is not having suicide ideation, they may be affected by a suicide loss in their school or broader community. So today we want to talk about how can we support our teens and tweens if they have experienced a suicidal loss in their broader community or their school atmosphere. And Dr. Linda Mcintosh is going to help us do that. Hi, Belinda. Thank you again.
Hi, Kamira. Thanks for asking me to be on the program. I'm happy to be here. So I can tell you a little bit about my background. So I'm a psychiatrist. I live in Atlanta. I trained at Emory. I served on the faculty of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science for a number of years. And I worked in college mental health, both at Georgia Tech and at Emory University. So that's my clinical background. And then just in terms of volunteer and community-oriented work, I was approached by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's Atlanta chapter many years ago. It was a very small chapter then. It is now a very large chapter. It is now the Georgia chapter of AFSP, and it's just a fantastic national organization with very active chapters all over the country. And they approached me just to do a presentation at colleges. A lot of Georgia colleges had a conference. They have it every year, and we were presenting on suicide and outreach and identifying students at risk. And that's how I got my first intro into the organization. And it's, I've been a part of the organization for, maybe 12 years now. I served on the board for a number of years, and now I'm just a volunteer. They call me up when someone needs an outreach, it might be a group, an organization, a church. I participate in the Out of the Darkness Walks, which is a big community event every year. You can find this information online. AFSP.org has a lot of information. I'll bring that up again later on in the program because it's just a site where there's just a trove of information to help anyone who is affected by suicide personally, who is affected by suicide loss, who may be at risk themselves, or who just want to get involved and be a supportive member of this community. So that's my background, and that's why I'm here.
Thank you. That's why you're the perfect person to address this with us. I want to remind anybody who's watching that the organization you mentioned, there is a link to that in the comment section, as well as to other organizations and helpful resources. You can scroll through the comment section and find something that will help you no matter where you may be in this process or during this discussion. Let's get right to it. Okay, it is estimated that for each person who dies by suicide, that they leave behind maybe at least 6 suicide survivors. Mm-hmm. What are suicide survivors?
Yeah, so what we use the term suicide survivor primarily to describe survivors of suicide loss. So these are the people who are most affected by the loss of a loved one. This could be a spouse, a parent, but truly suicide survivors also should include survivors of lived experience with suicidal ideation or suicide attempts. And so typically we refer to survivors of suicide loss if we want to be more specific. But the reality is that suicide survivorship can include both people with lived experience with suicidal thoughts or people who've been affected because someone they were close to or someone who they knew about. And you mentioned earlier for teens, kids in school, they may not have to know another student who died by suicide to be a loss survivor, because losses like that are felt particularly strongly in communities such as schools, where peers and their relationships with one another are really important. And they're also developing a context, developing an identity. And how they do that in part is by association with peers. So when a young person dies by suicide, young people in their atmosphere, in their community are often affected by that, even if they weren't particularly close to that individual. And because there's an identification with the person based on the community. And also, even though, as you mentioned, the numbers of actual, suicide deaths, it's a big number, but the rate in young people is, around 14 in 100,000. So whereas the rate of suicide deaths may seem relatively low compared to, lots of other things, it's a cause of death and the second leading cause of death, because that group does not tend to die. So these are unexpected for a lot of people. But most importantly, the ripple effect of a suicide loss, as you mentioned, affects a lot of people. So people might be surprised to learn that it's something like 85% of people will know someone personally in their lives who have died by suicide. And that may not mean that it's your loved one. It could be someone you worked with, someone you went to school with, first responders, teachers, certainly people in the community. And so suicide loss actually affects a lot of people. And that's a really important part of the message I want to help parents and other adults who work with teens, take care of teens, is to really emphasize they're not alone. There is a massive community of support out there and understanding out there around suicide loss.
Thank you. Another term I learned that fits right into this is suicide contagion. What is that?
So contagion is a particularly important phenomenon to discuss when you're talking about young people, because contagion, as with illness, the terminology refers to catching on, right? And so one of the big messages in terms of suicide, one of the big important points in suicide messaging is that when we're talking about suicide or there was a suicide loss, to be careful to not dramatize, include an exceptional level of graphic detail, publicize things, because there is a way that things can become a contagion phenomenon. Now, this is really an important distinction to make. There are ways to talk about suicide that are entirely appropriate, and actually it's best to make sure that we do talk to teens directly and honestly if they experienced a suicide loss, or if they come to you and ask a question about suicide. We should be able to have those conversations. But if something occurs, say in a school, and a young person dies by suicide, if that gets picked up and publicized in insensitive, inappropriate, inordinately graphic or shocking ways, in sort of a fetishizing or celebratory sort of way, that can be picked up and lead to what we call contagion phenomena. But we have resources such as the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. I think that you have that link up for folks, or you will. The SPRC is a great resource, as is AFSP, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And, how do you talk about suicide? How do you get the word out? There are documents available for press, for newsletters, for schools. how do you disseminate information about suicide in an appropriate way so as not to engender this contagion phenomenon? So that's what that refers to.
Okay, thank you. When our young people are experiencing a suicide loss of grief, whether it is directly related to someone in the house or in their broader community, or sometimes even further removed, it can be someone in the entertainment industry that they felt connected to. And I know that this is we're going to be speaking in generalities, and each individual is unique. But what type of things are they feeling? What is going on inside their head when they're grieving this type of loss?
Yeah. So as you said, first rule is it's very different for everybody. And it really, a lot of things can determine that. One of the biggest factors is what was the nature of the relationship? As you mentioned, this could be someone that maybe a teen really looked up to, but didn't know because they were a public figure, but they felt really connected to or identified with them. The feelings that come up there might be different than if the teen, certainly if the teen lost a sibling, a close friend, a parent. So the relationship sort of is the primary factor that might determine a lot of that. And another thing is, how did they learn about it? And were they involved? Because unlike many other deaths, suicide deaths sometimes are associated with trauma. And so if it was a traumatic loss, or how the teen learned about it happened in a way that was very traumatic for them, then that can be a part of the feelings that they can experience. So in suicide loss, generally, it is not uncommon for teens to talk about, or what we want to do is encourage them to talk about their feelings. And when they talk about their feelings, our job is to listen non-judgmentally. So they may say any number of things. They may feel angry. They will feel sad. They will feel responsible or guilty sometimes. They can feel abandoned. They can feel rejected. Feelings of abandonment and rejection are really common when it was a close relationship and the teen who is the loss survivor really depended on that person. So that's common in significant others. It's common in children who lose parents to suicide. But anguish, fear, is that going to happen to me? Am I going to lose other people? There's just a huge range of emotion, even sometimes relief, and then guilt about feeling relief if someone was struggling with a mental health, the behavioral effects of a mental health problem for a long time. Someone in the family may experience that emotion. And then there are the secondary emotions. So feeling angry at the deceased is actually quite common. And then what happens is secondarily feeling angry at oneself for feeling angry at the person they lost. So there's a huge range of emotions. And what I would encourage adults, to think about is, none of those emotions are wrong. Anything that a teen feels in this situation is okay. And that's the message, is what are you feeling? And it's okay to feel that way. And let's talk about what makes you feel that way.
Okay. So you just went over the emotional responses. Are there other types of responses, behavioral, physical, that we should be looking for?
Sure. So it's not uncommon to see changes in behavior that are associated with negative emotion that we might see in any loss. We may see withdrawal. We may see, irritability is a common way that sadness or depression can present in teens. You might see tiredness, loss of energy. A big one, especially for even younger kids, is not wanting to go to school. Having trouble concentrating, not feeling motivated to do homework, not interacting, not being as interested in connecting with other people. And if you really expand out from this picture of suicide loss, many of these things overlap with loss generally. So the process of grieving is really quite similar, but suicide loss comes with some additional painful emotions for a lot of people. But when you see how someone responds to a loss, you'll see a lot of the same behaviors. There's a retreating and a pulling inward. There may be a lashing out. And so what you want to do is make sure that you're careful to notice anything that, might be a sign that perhaps you need to get your teen some more help. some more support. And that might mean reaching out to their counselor at school. It might mean engaging a professional outside of school. It might mean getting them some accommodations. They need a little bit less homework. They need to be able to take breaks during the day. And so working with their school and other adults in their life, their coaches, to make sure they have the support that they need to grieve, to not be at their best.
I really like the tip about getting accommodations. That's something that I would not have thought of had you not mentioned it. So I want to repeat that for somebody else, that you may, especially if this happened outside of the immediate school community and you see that your student is having difficulties, you may want to investigate doing that within your school community. Mm-hmm. We have a comment I want to put up, and then we'll get to my next question. Mm-hmm. Lori says, high school and college age are the most at risk. She worries about her son daily. The stresses at this age are real. And thank you. Thank you, Lori, for watching and for making a comment.
Absolutely, Lori. That is so true. And we definitely know that with all of the pressure that a lot of kids are feeling at the high school and the college level, the social pressure, the academic pressure, the career pressure, the separating from home and family and becoming your own person, figuring out relationships for the first time, figuring out identity questions for the first time. I mean, it is just a perfect storm of stress. And so when you have someone in that phase of life lose someone to suicide or learn about the loss of a peer to suicide, it can really, really upend things. One of the things that might be helpful to folks like Lori is to realize that there are ways to intervene early if you start to notice signs that your teen is struggling. And I know that the topic today is really about coping with loss. But when we talk about coping with suicide loss, we're also talking about caring for the individual who's under stress. And so with the fact that teens are generally and young adults under a lot of stress, parents and caregivers of any kind, teachers, coaches, can really pay, and other relatives really pay close attention to how is their teen doing, and just try to check in with them, try to find that balance between giving them space and privacy and also keeping the door open that they can come to you and talk to you about anything. And the best way to do that is to listen non-judgmentally and always remember that their feelings are okay. There may be certain behaviors and how a teen acts on emotion, but the feelings themselves are okay and are worth listening to and understanding in a non-judgmental way.
And you keep emphasizing non-judgmental way, which is important because sometimes we don't mean to be.
Absolutely. And I think I emphasize it so much because, how I was distinguishing before, a lot of how you care for someone after a suicide loss is similar to how you care for someone after any loss, right? Mm-hmm. But suicide loss comes with a couple of barriers that make it particularly challenging for people. One I mentioned before was trauma. If the loss was traumatic, if the teen discovered the person who had died, if the teen heard about it in a very difficult way, maybe it was a very close friend and they ended up finding out on social media, there are ways that the loss can be experienced as traumatic. And then the other issue is that there's sometimes judgment, unfortunately, because there is a stigma associated with suicide and a stigma associated with mental illness. And so the normal avenues that people can turn to when they're grieving are sometimes blocked by things such as stigma and judgment. And so we want to make sure that we're providing a non-judgmental space where you can talk freely about a loss that's due to suicide, the very same way that you can talk about a loss that was due to an accident or an illness. Because suicide is the result in the vast majority of cases of a mental illness. And the person who died was literally struggling with that at the time of their death.
Okay, thank you. What can we do? What are some concrete things that we can do? It's the adults in our teens and tweens lives, and we know that they are grieving a suicide loss and we want to help them. What are some concrete things that we can do?
Okay, so I'm going to give you I'm going to suggest a number of things, but I'm going to highlight that most of these tips can be found through AFSP website, the afsp.org website. If you are a loss survivor or you're interested in learning more about suicide loss, or you want to support someone who's going through suicide loss, there are so many resources available there, including flip books and just a guide step by step, including by age range, whether it's a young child or an older child or an adolescent, how to talk with them about this. And you know, what I've read, almost every document says, first things first, take care of yourself. Often when a teen is grieving a suicide loss, their parent is too. They may have known the teen if it was a peer, and they have known the family member if it was a family member, and they also, just through empathizing with their child, experience the grief. So make sure that you're taking care of yourself. That accomplishes two things. One, you're in really much better shape to take care of your teen, and number two, you're doing a really important thing in terms of modeling healthy coping for them. So that means going back to basics, getting enough sleep, drinking plenty of water, eating well, trying to get outside and get some exercise if you can, and using the good support that you have. So that's the first thing. And then kind of coming back to the thing I keep saying is just to listen, and to listen non judgmentally, validate those emotions. Try your very best to not tell a teen, don't feel that. And that can be really tempting when a teen feels guilty. Survivor guilt is very common in suicide loss. You know, well, I was stressed out too, and I have this going on, and I have all of these things, and I'm still here and they're not. So survivor guilt is really common when you have a shared experience and then someone else dies and you're still there. And so it's more helpful to the teen to say, well, tell me about how you feel guilty, than to say, don't feel guilty, because you can't just not feel what you feel. But to be able to talk about it, and then to acknowledge and say, I know you feel a lot of guilt about that. And just to kind of keep the door open so they can keep talking about it. Other important things. So give them some consistency with their routines, right? You model good self-care, but you know, it can be tempting to just drop the reins and give them all latitude. But if they're not going to bed and they're not eating, parents in particular have to step in and make sure that they're taking good care of their basic health needs. Encouraging them to come to you and talk to you, but to also talk to others. Giving them information about suicide support groups, and maybe, you know, finding one that they can go to, talking to their counselor at school to make sure that they're well supported at school, talking to other adults in their lives and other people who may have expectations of them, so that that's kind of one of the way that we put accommodations in place casually in our lives, is we say, hey, you know, Jake's going through a rough time, you know, let's not ask a lot of him at family dinner on Sunday. He might need to take some breaks, and don't have that kid feel like they need to perform and be okay when they're really having a hard time. It might mean putting a few more limits on the social media, especially if it's a peer loss. There can sometimes be uninformed people who make comments that are really negative. Helping your teen cope ahead, because sometimes if they were very close to the person who died, if it was a family member or if it was a close friend, they may get questions that feel inappropriate, people digging for details. And that's not productive or helpful. And helping that teen to already know going into the situation, look, if someone comes to you and they're saying things that are negative, or they're asking for a lot of detail, it's okay for you to just say, I can't really talk about that. You know, I prefer not to talk about that, and to step away. Creating those breaks for themselves. And then another thing that's really important is making sure that the teen knows that it's okay to feel happy too. And this is really common with teenagers. They can be in a really difficult place, and then the friends come over to take them out, and they're happy and they go out and they have a good time. That doesn't mean we should expect of them that when they get back, they're going to go right into their homework because they're doing well. It's okay for them to go back and forth between periods of joy and enjoyment and being back into places of sadness. I didn't mention earlier, you know, teens can have really gloomy emotions, including hopelessness when they lose someone to suicide. It can really kind of shake you up. It's okay to explore that and make sure that you keep an eye out for if they might express any thoughts about death or about suicide themselves. So pay attention to whether there are warning signs. If there's behavioral acting out that's aggressive or hostile, if there's self-harm or there's talk of that, it's time to make sure that you get them in to see someone and be evaluated so they're getting all the support that they need. I'm going to see if I've left out anything that's also really important. That's most of what I've come up with. I think it's also really important to help them talk about the person they lost. And this is true in any loss, but in suicide loss, it's okay too. Talk about your good memories of the person. And one of the things to really try to support your teen around is that when there's a suicide loss, there are always going to be unanswered questions. And we can get really stuck, adults too, in trying to figure out why. And it's just the nature of suicide. We're never really going to get all of the answers as to why it happened. And there are associated feelings with that: confusion, anger. And it's really important to remind folks here that that person was really, really struggling at the time, and we're never going to get all of the answers.
Mm-hmm. When there was a death by suicide in my community, we had a group session with somebody who spoke with us. And one of the things that the moderator said that was wonderful is that, as you've mentioned, that most times when there is death by suicide, the person was suffering mental health issues. And so she told us, she said, I know you have questions and you're going to keep struggling with trying to answer them, but please remind yourself that a healthy mind does not understand an unwell mind in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's probably not possible for you to understand why this person made that decision. And you should free yourself from the attempt to try to understand it.
Absolutely.
And I like to always share that with people because it helps me so much. So I always share it, hoping that it helps someone else. I liked how you said for our teens, when they tell us that they're feeling something and it's something difficult and we really don't want them to feel it, we try to push them away from it, that instead say, tell me about how you feel. Tell me about that you feel angry. Tell me about how you feel remorse, survivor's remorse, and engage them rather than push them away from what is very uncomfortable and scary.
Yes, and absolutely. And follow that up with a validation. Wow, it must be really hard to feel guilty when you've lost someone. You know, it must be really hard to feel like somehow you were responsible for that. And, you know, education is a big part of how we help survivors cope with loss. Understanding more about suicide is actually one of the important things we need to do as adults who are taking care of teens who are survivors of suicide loss. When we know more, as you've just mentioned, the number of things that you've learned over the years, when we know more about suicide death, we can help our teens understand how these things can happen, how they can hurt, and how that doesn't mean you're responsible. And still, it's understandable that you have those feelings because so many people have those feelings. A really important message to always drive home is you're not alone. There are so many survivors of suicide loss out there, which brings me to another helpful thing we can do for teens, especially if they're involved in a school community or another community where this loss occurred. Tributes are a really wonderful way that young people kind of come together in solidarity in their grief, consoling each other, remembering the person that they lost, commemorating their lives. Give your teen the freedom to choose whether they want to attend the funeral. Let them choose whether they want to spend time with the family of the person they lost. Let them choose whether they want to get involved in a suicide support group, or maybe create a team and go to an out of the darkness walk. That can be a really healing experience. And again, there are lots of resources you'll find on the AFSP website, including community walks all over the country, that can really be a time to come together with other suicide loss survivors who have experienced some of the same kinds of pain that your teen is going through.
Thank you. Now our audience understands why I said at the top of this show that you are the person to have this conversation with. You have given us such valuable information, and I am grateful for that. There's one thing I want you to tell us about before we go, and we are at the end of our time together today. Can you tell us about the new hotline?
Oh, yeah. So this is a fantastic new development. And this has been just since, I mean, this is a hot off the presses since July of this year. And this is the culmination of advocacy efforts over many years to make crisis services available on a national level for people who are going through a mental health crisis, a suicidal crisis, or a substance use crisis. And that is the National 988 crisis line. And it's called a crisis line because you don't have to be suicidal to call this crisis line. You could be having a really hard time struggling with whatever, and you can literally text or call 988, and you can talk to a live person who's been trained in crisis intervention. You can text with them, or you can start a chat. And that's live in real time with a real person. And the focus of that is to help you to manage the crisis and guide you to support. And so this is possible because of a network of crisis hotlines all over the country coming together. And I mean, the advocacy work and the organizational work and the cooperative work across the country to make this a reality has been just a huge step forward in terms of how we can support healthy coping, mental health, getting to treatment, getting crisis services, because sometimes what's not needed is a 911 call. Sometimes what's needed is someone who can listen, understand, and point you in the direction where you can get. Generally, the point is to get you to in-person support near where you are. And so that's 988. Now, the 988 hotline is not the only resource. We also have the crisis text line, which is 741-741. And you just have to text TALK to 741-741. And that is a text helpline as well. And then before we had 988, we had the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And I think that there's not a definite date when they're going to end that. As of now, it's indefinitely still open. So there are many different resources. That number is 800-273-TALK or 800-273-8255. And that's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And that's what we had in place. And that's what 988 is actually adding to and providing additional services besides what we had. So, and becoming a trained professional to handle those calls is actually another way that survivors of suicide loss have sometimes chosen to get involved.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful note to know. We have these resources, and becoming involved with the resources is a way for you to deal with and move beyond your grief and feel as if you're having an impact on the issue that's important to you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Belinda. I really appreciate it. This was an important conversation.
I'm glad I could be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for watching. Please join us again on Thursday when Sue will have another important conversation, same time, same place. So it'll be 10:30 a.m. Eastern time on whichever social media platform you've joined us. It could be Facebook, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and you can watch a replay on Instagram. So we try to have you covered. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.